Oh, looks like we're live, and since we have a quorum, uh, why don't we proceed? And Mr. Cole will join us when he gets back. If we could have a roll call, please.
Yes, Chairman Brown,
Here.
Vice Chair Cole, Dr. Pierce, Joellen Klein,
Present.
Francis Beasley,
Present.
Kelsey Ellingson,
Present.
Jaron Holt, Emily White.
Here.
Chair Brown, we do have a quorum.
Wonderful.
And I'd like to remark, I think you indicated earlier that Vice Chair Cole is present. He stepped out of the room.
Right, so we can note his entrance when he gets back here. In the meantime, this is the first time in a number of months that we've had a quorum, and nice that it's in person. We have 4 sets of minutes to approve. Those from October 14 of 21, November 11th of 21, December 19th of 21, and January 13th of 22. All those minutes have been distributed. You've had a chance to look at those. Any corrections on any of the minutes? Wonderful. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
And I'll second.
Who made the motion?
And if there are no further corrections, minutes, and without objection, the minutes are approved. First important matter of business is to introduce you to our new staff person who's going to be working with our committee, and that's Kyle Lathwell. Kyle's over here, and she is a policy analyst, and she's working from the office of Mr. Barnes, our general counsel. And Kyle, welcome. Welcome to Columbus City Schools.
Nice to see all of you.
And was it 3 weeks now?
Yeah, I'm in my end of my 3rd week.
Great. And from where do you come to us?
I've been a policy consultant at OSBA for the past just about 6 years. Yeah.
That's great. Very good. Well, I look forward to your help, and I think this will be good. Perhaps even to free up James Barnes to do legal work.
A little
bit.
A little bit.
Yes.
Yes. Chair Brown, a little more background regarding Kyle. She has a very diverse background. She's also a former police officer. She's also been an educational aide in a different school district, and she's also been with the Ohio. She served as an assistant attorney general with the Ohio Attorney General's office, and also worked in with a private law firm. So she brings a wealth of diverse experience to assist us with our policies.
Well, thank you. That's all experience that sounds very useful to us, very helpful. And we look forward to the benefit of everything you have to bring.
Thank you.
We've got quite a few policies in front of us. And the first one, I hope we can move along. The only reason we hadn't, I believe, is lack of a quorum. But policy 0169.1 should be on the top of your pile. And this is the policy dealing with public comment at board meetings. There has been quite a bit of discussion over time. And I don't know that anybody has any questions with this. I note Mr. Cole's arrival or return. Uh, any questions about this policy on public comment at board meetings? The only two very minor changes are shown in red, but we worked out the issues about when somebody would need to sign up to be able to comment, and some of the other mechanical errors or mechanical issues. If we're ready to proceed, do we have a motion to approve this policy?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Great. Got that one done. And we next have two policies. Okay, I'm sorry. We have. Is it?
There's,
We have we have 2266.
yes,
I've got two copies.
yeah, there are two copies. One is a clean copy. The second copy is a tracked, edited copy from an update that we received from Neola.
Ah, okay. And then the third document is the administrative guidelines that would correspond to this. These are not necessarily here for approval, since this body, neither this body nor the board approve administrative guidelines. However, they're here to help inform us and to show how the administration thinks about the policy and how they intend to implement it, and that may be useful as we consider the policy itself. Mr. Barnes, do you have anything to present with this?
Yes, our compliance manager, Aisha Powell, will give you an introduction of what the policy is about and why we've created this policy. It is a mandate from the United States Department of Education, and it does regard Title IX sexual harassment, and it's required that all public agencies that receive federal funds have a grievance process. And this policy complies with that mandate from the federal government. So I'll introduce Aisha, and Aisha, if you could come to the table to talk a little bit about the policy. And Aisha has been with the district a little longer than Kyle has. She comes to us from the Department of Transportation, and she worked a lot with the Ohio Attorney General's office in that capacity, and served in many roles with the Department of Transportation. And I am proud to say that Aisha is a proud graduate of East High School.
All right. Go Tigers. The other Tigers.
All right.
With that, I'll turn it over to Aisha.
Okay. I don't know that there's a whole lot more to say to introduce it, in addition to what James has already said. Basically, the Title IX regulations have been in place for decades, but the government did an update in 2020, and so the update that they did in 2020 has required recipients of federal funds in the education area to implement new policies or update their existing policies to comply with the new regulations that came out in 2020. So that's basically what this does. This policy puts in place a grievance procedure and updates definitions and some requirements that have been put in place by the U.S. Department of Education. So that's sort of the basics. The regulations are pretty prescriptive. So basically, what the policy does is just ensures that we have put the regulations into our policy so that we can implement our grievance procedure in compliance with the new regulations.
Great. Are there any substantive changes in any of this material?
Substantive from, and compared to,
Well, I understand that it's making sure that this complies with the law. Is there anything beyond those kinds of compliance measures to make sure it complies with the law? Is there any substantive change in the policy that we're thinking about?
well, so basically the existing policy, so we don't have a standalone Title IX policy. What we have in existence is an anti-harassment policy. And the anti-harassment policy that's in place covers our responsibilities under other non-discrimination and anti-harassment laws, but also includes Title IX and sex discrimination and sexual harassment under Title IX. So the grievance procedure that they've put in place under the new regulations is different enough that you need a standalone policy to ensure compliance. And it does have some changes. The changes to the regulations are different than they were before. They do provide more rights to respondents, people who are accused of wrongdoing. So there were a lot of measures put into place to make sure that they're treated fairly, that that we treat both parties equally, that we offer supportive measures to both parties. That we do not impose discipline before the process is completed. So there's some things like that that were put into place. The definitions have changed slightly. So typically, under civil rights law, harassment is severe or pervasive. In this case, it's severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive. So it's sort of a higher standard. They've given us some options as far as our standard of evidence, whether we want to do a preponderance or clear and convincing. We have chosen preponderance, which is consistent with other civil rights laws. So there are some differences as far as where Title IX was to where the regulations are now, that were addressed with the policy.
Good, thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for, is those kinds of things. Mr. Cole?
I have a couple questions. One, can you define preponderance, please?
Preponderance basically just means a little more than 50%. So,
Yes, more likely than not.
yeah, more likely than not that it occurred.
All right, so that would fall under the category of inculpatory evidence, yes or no?
I'm sorry.
Would that fall under the category of inculpatory evidence?
No, inculpatory evidence would be a part of the overall determination and evidence that's presented for the fact finder to make a determination.
Okay.
Yep. The burden of proof, the preponderance of evidence or clear and convincing, is sort of the overall presentation of all the facts and circumstances and evidence. When you consider them together in totality, is it more likely than not that sexual harassment occurred? That's what the preponderance gets at. So when we look at the totality of circumstances, is it more likely than not that this happened?
Okay, so this leads to my question, and thank you for clarifying that. What you have described as something that has been 50% or better, clearly identified. It's fact, we know. What of that gray area? And I'm going to allude to a question that Ms. Emily White asked the last meeting that actually kind of raised my level of attention to it. Because we more often than not tend to look at this from the standpoint of preponderance, as opposed to how do we deal with a situation in gray area. The question that she arose was, how do you deal with a situation from a policy standpoint? How do we identify in our policy how to separate the respondent from the afflicted, the alleged afflicted, and the alleged respondent? If there's a situation where you got 2 students in a class, or maybe even 2 employees in a building, where there has been an accusing of sexual harassment, or there had been an actual act, but there's no preponderance established at that point. How do we address that? How do we, in the policy, address that? Do we keep them out of the classroom? Do we transition that employee to another building? How do we address that?
So there's a couple of things, and if the alleged conduct meets the definition of sexual harassment, what we can do is pretty prescriptive, and then if it doesn't, that also is prescriptive. So basically, the regulations provide for supportive measures. So we can put supportive measures in place, and we're actually supposed to, and we can offer them to the complainant, the person who's the action allegedly occurred to, and then we can put them in place for the respondent. So we can determine what sort of supportive measures need to be put in place. So if it's things like changing a schedule or putting a no contact order in place, there are provisions also for emergency removal. So if we need to do an emergency removal of a student, there are steps that we have to go through to do that, but we can do that. If we need to put an employee on administrative leave, we can do that as well, and that's included in here. So it would be addressed under probably the supportive measures that we provide to the complainant and the respondent, and then also possibly if it rises to the level of emergency removal or administrative leave.
And those supportive measures, that language on superintendent shall provide supportive measures when requested for is something like that in this policy as it stands?
Yes, so in the definition section, so you'll find on page 3, there's a definition of supportive measures, and then when you get into the grievance procedure and when a person makes a report, I do believe that there is some language that says the Title IX coordinator will reach out to the complainant and discuss with the complainant supportive measures as well as how to file a formal complaint. So it is mentioned in there. There's also a section on page 5 that talks about emergency removal. So those are included.
Thank you. Thank you. I see it. See them both.
What did you say on page 5?
Emergency removal.
There's some addition, Emily?
I've got some comments and 2 questions. First, I want to say I really appreciate the additions to add a firm but also doable timeline on here, especially having like a time frame and a goal for each step of the investigative process. I think that's so important for accountability and so that people understand the urgency of resolving these. I've got two questions. The severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive, that just like caught my eye immediately whenever I read it, and I appreciate your response, and you're correct, that is the language in Title IX. But it still bothers me thinking about the practicalities of what that means, especially when you compare to the employment context. Severe, usually means a really terribly egregious incident, and
Yes.
pervasive is something that can be just as invidious, but happens every day.
Right.
And I'm thinking here, like you might have a student subjected to some really degrading name calling that happens every single day. And that is the kind of thing that we know realistically could deprive one of our students of the opportunity to have equal access to education. So I guess what I'm wondering, and I appreciate that you're working within some very rigid guidelines and requirements of the Office of Civil Rights with the U.S. Department of Education. Is it possible, do we have discretion to choose to have it severe or pervasive and objectively offensive?
We do not.
Okay.
So this is, the definition included in here is the definition that is in the regulation. Now, I will say that what the Department of Education has said is that the conduct as alleged has to meet the definition. Even if it were true, if it wouldn't be sexual harassment under the regulations, then we would dismiss it. Now, to say that doesn't mean that we wouldn't deal with it. That would just give us the freedom then to deal with it under
The other policy?
the other policy. So we could deal with it under the anti-harassment policy, which is closer to the other non-discrimination and anti-harassment laws. We could deal with it under our student code of conduct or an employee handbook. So this is very prescriptive. We don't have a lot of wiggle room to make those types of modifications. But when that definition doesn't apply, then we do have the freedom to say, okay, so it's not Title IX, but we can still address the conduct then under another policy.
Thank you. I do have a question about one other part of the policy, and your response makes perfect sense, by the way. The other part that caught my eye was this provision about what happens if somebody makes a false statement in the process. And the troubling thing to me about that is just because the range of behavior, the types of things that this policy addresses are by their very nature things that typically happen in private. There's not necessarily going to be a tremendous amount of evidence, and in many cases it's going to come down to a he said, she said. On the other hand, false statements are incredibly harmful. They can have all sorts of ramifications, and it's corrosive to any sort of adjudication when somebody lies or makes up evidence in a process. But I just worry that, I mean, I appreciate that it has the word knowingly makes a false statement, but I wonder if this is an area where, because we're saying that a student is going to be subjected to the student code of conduct, and everybody is notified of that up front, which is appropriate to maintain the integrity of the process. I wonder if either in the policy itself or in the administrative guidelines, that should be a clear and convincing standard. I would hate that some student would feel that their voice will not be heard, and if they don't prevail in the sexual harassment complaint against anyone, whether a teacher or a principal or a fellow student or the person who works with them at the lunch line or a bus driver, whether they will fear that they will be disciplined for that.
That is a good question. I'm not sure what would be the best way to address that, because what the Department of Education has said is that if we include a clear and convincing standard in our policy, then it's clear and convincing for everything, for students and staff. So I don't know if we could do a carve out for just a false statement investigation. Because the standard of proof that is really pertaining to the sexual harassment itself, but I'm almost wondering if we're dealing with a false statement issue, that would suggest that it would then get investigated under whatever policy or handbook, addresses making false statements, and then it would just follow whatever standards or guidelines are under that particular policy. So it would kick out, because it's not sexual harassment, it's knowingly making a false
Malfeasance,
statement.
what is it?
What's that?
Would it be malfeasance? I mean, what would it be considered? You're falsifying statements, if you're doing things, that are antithetical and opposite what is legal to us via policy and via legal, statutory, or federal standards that we follow, that we design our policies based on, would that then qualify as malfeasance? What would it qualify as?
Well, the way that it's worded in the policy is just simply knowingly making a false statement. But the Title IX regulations don't address a process for adjudicating that. So what I'm suggesting is that what would happen is if during the course of the investigation, the investigator, Title IX coordinator, whoever was made aware that somebody knowingly made a false statement during the course of the investigation, that issue would not be processed under this policy. That issue would then be addressed under whatever existing policy talks about the consequences for making a false statement. So I think in the Student Code of Conduct, it says that you're not permitted to make a false statement, and they have a grid of whatever the offense level is for that and whatever the interventions are for that. So it would go then under the Student Code of Conduct and get addressed that way. For an employee, it would go under the Staff Code of Conduct and get addressed according to what is prescribed in the Staff Code of Conduct for knowingly making a false statement. So it would come out from under this, because this is only for sexual harassment, and then get addressed under those policies or codes of conduct.
So if I may, we might need some revision then of the current one, because it says the board will not tolerate such conduct which is a violation of the Student Code of Conduct. So if it just says student, then we might want to make sure that we bring in any other, in case there's a different staff member involved. But also, I mean, right there, it is saying it is a violation. So it's already making that determination right there. Maybe we could say it would be referred to that.
Yes, and we can do that. We can make that change. There is a place, it's on page 6, where it talks about providing notice that does indicate that the parties would be informed of provisions in the Student Code of Conduct, Staff Code of Conduct, and it does say in this policy about prohibiting knowingly making false statements. But those are adjustments we can make to make that more clear about the Student Code of Conduct and Staff Code of Conduct, and that it would be addressed under those.
If we could include that in all of this, throughout this entire policy, that this is not just the responsibility of our students, this is not just action in support of or against them, but also our staff. I think that would be very important.
In terms of just, sort of cleanup of the language we have now, at the top it says it's a violation for the complainant, the respondent, or a witness, which makes sense, again, if we're concerned about the integrity of the process. But the informing of is only directed to the parties.
Yes.
I'm not sure how witnesses are involved here. Actually, one of my other questions was going to be how has this policy worked on the ground for us? Have there been any practical issues or situations that, could be better addressed by a policy change?
So, because we haven't had an approved policy we haven't necessarily been doing all of the things that are prescribed because you want to make sure folks are on notice that this is what we're doing. And without being able to refer them to an approved policy and saying this is our grievance procedure. So this isn't necessarily in place since we're in a draft stage at this point. I don't know. I have not gotten, and again, I've only been here since July. I haven't gotten any. I've gotten a couple of phone calls about inappropriate behavior that would not rise to the level of sexual harassment under this definition. We've definitely had complaints filed by employees. They have not been sexual harassment complaints. Gotten, like I said, calls about a couple of student-on-student issues that would not rise to this level, that were dealt with by the building administrator, the school principal. So how this will actually work, doing this prescriptive of a process and all these notices and things, I'm not sure yet exactly how that will go, because we're going to actually need to train anybody who's going to be involved in this process. We're going to have to train our principals if they're going to be our investigators, which is what we're proposing at the building level. If employee relations is going to have a role, they're going to need to be trained. We're going to have decision makers that are going to need to be trained on the scope of their role under the policy as well.
If I may, on page 5, this actually makes students mandatory reporters of all harassment as well. Students are required to report allegations of sex discrimination and harassment to the Title IX coordinator. That sounds daunting.
I will have to double check if that's required. This policy was drafted by our vendor. They began work on it in 2020 when the regulations took effect, and a lot of work was done on the language prior to my arrival. So there are definitely some things like that that I overlooked as far as mandatory reporting. So I'll double check and see if the regulations require that, and if there's a way to make an adjustment. That wasn't one of the things that I focused on, but I'll check it.
Ms. White, can you read the paragraph where that is on?
Sure, it's on page 5 at the top. It's the first full paragraph. It says, students, board members, and board employees are required, and other members of the school district community and third parties are encouraged to report allegations of sex discrimination or sexual harassment promptly to the Title IX coordinator or to any board employee. So now you've got not only reporters, but you've got mandatory recipients of any board employee, which is also an odd way of phrasing it. And I appreciate, again, that you're working on short notice with new regulations that have changed a lot and are mostly directed towards university populations, which is very different than a universe that includes preschoolers. So
Absolutely. And so I think what this provision is trying to get at is just, if you see something, say something. Tell whoever you feel comfortable telling, but ultimately it needs to get to the Title IX coordinator so that it can be addressed properly per the required grievance procedure. So I think that's what it's trying to get at, is that we don't want somebody to be aware and then not do anything about it, because then we can't do anything about it if we don't know about it. So I think that's what they're trying to get at here.
But the punitive action, I mean, to your argument, the punitive action is not taken against the student, it's taken against the employee. So if a board employee fails to report an incident of sexual harassment of which the board employee is aware, the board employee may be subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination. So this particular clause may, as you said, see and tell. If you see something, say something. And that includes a student, right, in terms of requirement. But the punitive action, as I read it, does not impact the student,
Right.
child. It actually impacts the adult who knew and didn't say.
Right, and I think that is,
So I think it deals with the daunting factor of it without having to worry about punitive action against a child.
yeah, I mean, like I said, I think clearly they want anybody who's aware to say something. But again, as far as and I know it says are required, but I think the real requirement lies with the employees, which is why the discipline attaches if an employee doesn't report, as opposed to that does not impact a student in the same way. But I'll look and see what, if any, flexibility we have with that language.
You could just include students in that encouraged part, that sentence, either just right after it.
I'll have to check and make sure that we can do that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, we'll have to check to see whether that was one of the requirements from the Department of Education or whether it was a suggested language from Neola.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Aisha.
Mm-hmm.
On page 5, in that 5, in that 6th paragraph, it says, because the board is considered to have actual knowledge of sexual harassment or allegations of sexual harassment, if any employee has such knowledge, and because the board must take specific actions when it has notice of sexual harassment. What does it mean when it says a board member who has independent knowledge or receives a report?
So that basically means if any employee is aware of potential sexual harassment, so it would be however they come into having that knowledge. They saw something occur, somebody reported something to them, however they came to have that information, they now have that information. And because they have that information, the district has that information, which is why they need to then report that to the Title IX coordinator so that it can be addressed.
And this type of language is also very similar to our insurance coverage, mandatory reporters. If someone who is designated as a mandatory reporter does not report, then there's no liability coverage for the district. So it's very important for if you see something or receive something, say something.
Joellen?
So I just have, excuse me, I have a couple of questions. On page 2, why are we defining rape as anything other than what's in 290702?
I'm sorry, I'm not clear on what you're referring to as.
So the Ohio Revised Code has a definition of rape in the state of Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
This policy defines rape differently than that Ohio Revised Code section.
So the Code of Federal Regulations specifically says that sexual assault will be defined as it is in the U.S. Code, and sexual assault includes rape. And then it has the specific, it includes rape, sodomy, sexual assault, fondling, incest, and statutory rape. And so then those, it has a definition of how those are supposed to be defined.
Okay.
So it's referring to how they're defined in federal law.
Okay. And then my other question is on page 7 about dismissals of complaints. And one of the mandatory dismissal provisions is that the action did not occur against a person in the United States. So if you are on a spring break trip to France and you are harassed, then this policy would not apply?
That's correct.
What does that student or teacher do?
Well, that means then we would have the freedom to then address the behavior conduct under our other policy,
So
our
quick question.
anti-harassment policy.
This is, your question would be tied to a student activity. So if you're saying that they went to Paris as a class, as a student activity, and a student was, or a staff member was sexually harassed by someone within our learning community during this activity, this could constitute that. I mean, I could have swore I just read it.
This policy then does not apply. So nobody gets the due process that this policy affords for having taken that action on foreign soil.
That is correct, and that is what is in the Code of Federal Regulations. The U.S. Department of Education specifically decided that actions outside of the United States, even if they're within your education program or activity, would not be covered.
And I appreciate that, but also we can do more than the federal law requires us to do. We can't do less, but we can do more. So my question is why would we not afford the same due process provisions to those students or those staff members that we're affording the folks who have something happen here in the United States?
So for the purposes of this specific policy, the Code of Federal Regulations requires us to dismiss complaints that fall under these three categories. So we don't have an option. They require this. What we would then need to do if we want to afford complainants the same level of due process is then we would need to update our current anti-harassment policy that would address such an incident to afford these same levels of due process.
I'm a little confused by that. In the dismissal of a formal complaint section on page 6, it says the district shall investigate the allegations in a formal complaint unless the conduct alleged in the formal complaint would not constitute sexual harassment. Okay. B, did not occur in the district's education program or activity. If something like what she just described occurred within an activity that was sponsored, paid for, had staff that were engaged in an activity, this would fall under not dismissal, but actually investigation. We can actually investigate.
There's a third one. It says, or did not occur against a person in the United States. So I think that's the issue she's concerned about, is that if it didn't happen inside the United States, we're required to dismiss it. And we are under this policy. That's what the regulations require. But like I said, anytime this
Supported by our policy.
anytime this policy doesn't apply, anytime the Title IX regulations do not apply, we have the freedom to still address the conduct under our other non-discrimination, anti-harassment policies and any code of conduct or handbook that we have in place that addresses the behavior.
Aisha, if I may, Um, I, you've answered that way on a number of things. And since I haven't read this carefully yet, number one, does this reference that matters that don't fall specifically under this policy may be addressed under the other policies that you're describing? I think having that say so in here expressly would be a good idea. And then secondly, I think it does make sense for us to take a look at all of those other policies and and to include some due process measures, perhaps by reference to this, perhaps by restating this, or maybe this doesn't fit precisely, and we want to make sure that there are due process rights, but maybe not specifically these. But I think those are matters that we really need to give some thought to.
So the policy does say that if this policy doesn't apply, then we can still address the conduct under our other policy, and it says policies, codes of conduct, or employee or administrator handbook. So it does say that. And as far as addressing updating the other policies, we defer to Kyle. We can do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that we can take a look at.
Yep. In
Emily?
fact, the small paragraph reads, any allegations of sexual misconduct, sexual activity not involving sexual harassment will be addressed through the procedures outlined in board policies. I mean, that's just one of those areas where it's cited. But yes, I still agree that maybe we take a look at where we are on the board side of things
Okay.
and see where we can clean stuff up or clarify it.
Go ahead.
So on, this did not occur against a person in the United States. I agree with the consensus of others that I think that this is probably setting the floor and not the ceiling. And if we can include that, I think that we should, if we have the discretion to do so. But additionally, I think regardless of how that turns out, we should clarify if, there's very few of these incidents, very little of the conduct that is covered by this is a one-time thing that doesn't have any other ramifications in the educational programs. So if you have a wrestling coach who's abusing his wrestlers and has a trip to Canada where some of the abuse occurs, I think that we should also clarify that every single bit of conduct that occurs within the U.S. that's part of a program is absolutely included, even if one portion of it occurred outside the country. In other words, I don't think somebody should get a get out of jail free card and have an entire complaint dismissed because some portion of the conduct that's included within the complaint occurred outside of the United States.
And I do think that would not be what happened. I think, and I as the Title IX coordinator, and I would obviously expect our investigators as well, to look at the full scope of the allegations, and if any of them met the definition and did not require dismissal, then we would investigate those. Now, we might have to dismiss these one specific allegation that concerned the trip to Canada, but we would investigate all of the other allegations.
But even in that hypothetical, if they returned and then the coach is texting or emailing from the U.S., I would expect the district to take action in that. Every one of these circumstances, these are happening in real life and actually, harming students in ways that we've seen in other communities. And I hope that this does have more, this has been acknowledged, more due process than some of the other policies we have, and it has it for a reason. And in some of these, I think we should maximize the coverage.
Yes, our current policies do cover those type of situations where our employee relations department does investigate those instances. This policy does not negate anything that the district is currently doing. And our Employee Relations Department regularly investigates complaints. Our compliance office regularly investigates those complaints and reach determinations. There are no criteria for dismissal except for there's no jurisdiction for it within the compliance department, or it's not a district-related matter.
Mr. Chairman, so, I mean, since I started this, I'll put a pin in it. I would like at the next meeting, before we move forward on this policy, to be able to see the other policies that this kind of conduct could be investigated and action taken under, in order to see what due process exists in those policies.
I agree.
I agree, especially since it says if one of the preceding circumstances exist, the Title IX coordinator shall dismiss the formal complaint.
Yeah.
But then it says the district may still investigate. It doesn't seem to give much,
Well, it gives us the discretion.
that's what I'm,
If it kicked under another policy, then we would follow that policy, which would then require the investigation.
Such as Section 5,000 of our policy, that is 5517.01. Aggressive behavior, bullying, such things. I mean, we state clearly that we prohibit such behavior, and it cites exactly what we would do, what falls or encapsulates in that, perceived by sexual orientation, religion, natural origin, age, gender, all of that. I mean, all of it is violence within a dating relationship, aggressive behavior, which is defined as inappropriate conduct that is repeated enough or serious enough to negatively impact the student's educational, physical, or emotional well-being. So this policy and this is only one I've read so far, but this policy would absolutely encapsulate how we would, outside of what is federally required, how we go above and beyond what is federally required in a sexual harassment complaint. If I'm making any sense, with my
That is
good eye,
correct.
I see you nodding your head.
That is correct.
Let me ask, with respect to the scenario that was described of a series of harassment where one of the incidents occurred in Canada, say. Clearly, we would not have jurisdiction to act on that under this policy. However, you'd have discretion, if I understand, you'd have discretion to investigate. Could that evidence of what happened in Canada be used in terms of the Title IX complaint process with respect to the incidents that occurred
Yes.
in home?
Yes, the answer is
To allow for it to be more likely than not to have occurred here.
correct.
Okay.
That's-
'Cause
let me,
we can look at patterns
Yeah.
Thank you, right.
Okay.
in their
Exactly.
totality.
You mentioned that the policy gives the district discretion to further investigate. The district already has an obligation to investigate.
Right.
There is no discretion. We are obligated to conduct an investigation.
Right.
Regardless of where the incident or action happens.
Okay. And then to use that information,
Yeah,
if it's establishing a pattern of all US-based conduct, we can use that. Okay.
Yes, and it need not be a pattern. It can be a single incident.
Well, it would have to be at least two, one here and one outside
Well,
the state.
if the only incident was the incident that occurred in Canada, what James is saying is that we would still be obligated to investigate that, but it would be under our anti-harassment policy, not under our Title IX policy.
Right.
But I think the concern is that there's more due process provided in the Title IX policy. Maybe we want to look at our anti-harassment policy and see if we need to add some additional due process for things such as that, such as the one incident in Canada, to make sure that the complainant and respondent are afforded the same rights, and that the rights are not different because the perpetrator waited to do it when they were outside the United States.
So,
That- Yeah, that's all helpful, thank you.
yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm sure they will print us this policy, that again, including activities on school property, on a bus, it's shown on there, it just disappeared on me. On a bus, during school activities, I mean, this policy that is specifically related to how we deal with aggressive behavior, harassment, bullying, all of those things is encapsulated in here. So if it was a school-sponsored event, our policy as a board says that we have to promptly address that. We shall. It says we shall, not we may, we think we're going to. It says we shall promptly address these matters. So please just print out that report, that piece for us so that we can see it, even if you wanted to highlight certain sections that identify our areas of concern. I think that would be very helpful.
Emily?
Sure, but I think that the reason, I think we're probably all in agreement that we've got multiple policies that could cover, but what's unique about this particular policy is the rights and duties and privileges and process that it gives to the person who's made the complaint and the person who's the respondent. And so if you go to like page 8, for instance, when it goes through all of the, parties shall have a right to present witnesses, to present exculpatory, inculpatory evidence, to have somebody who's an advisor present. Those are all very maximum due process, and that is not present, I don't believe, in our existing policies. There are good reasons why these requirements are present for this type of discrimination. I mean, the reason the Department of Education keeps changing these is because of, moving from one situation that doesn't work to another. But these are not present, and so whenever we're trying to figure out is our other policy sufficient, I think we have to think about what is the harm this is designed to address, and is our existing due process going to be fair to people who are making a complaint or are on the receiving end of the complaint in other circumstances that are going to fall outside of this policy.
Well, clearly, this has been a good start, and I don't know if anybody has anything more that they want to raise this morning. Get to you in one moment, Lindsay. But this will have to come back. That will provide us all an opportunity to read this all more carefully than just kind of picking things out that we happen to see when we're looking for the first time. As well as to answer some of the questions that have been raised, and also to provide at least a list of those other policies that we may need to look at. I don't know if we want to necessarily print out all of those, but at least have a list. And, sounds like we do want to look at the sexual harassment piece, and that would make sense. But we also are referring to student handbook, the staff handbook, and that we need to give those some thought as well to make sure that there are adequate due process rights for all concerned. I don't know whether whether the handbook or guidance for staff is something that is negotiated or not. But if it is, obviously there's a different approach to making or suggesting any
Right,
changes.
due process for collective bargain is something that has its own set of parameters. It doesn't negate board policy, but the due process aspect of it has its agreed upon in their contracts, agreed upon course of due process. It does.
So we can get together the other codes of conduct and policies that would be utilized if this one didn't apply, so that you have the opportunity to look over those if you would like. So we can do that for you.
Is there, Lindsay?
Just one thing has me thinking on page 6, back to that portion about making false statements. I'll tell you where I'm going with this at the end. Is I'm curious what level of information we can get from the district about how this comes into play, or how this has come up in the past, because in the public discourse around sexual harassment in schools, it's known that those who are unsuccessful at times face discipline themselves. Unsuccessful complainants face discipline themselves. And yet it isn't a logical following that if there was insufficient evidence to discipline the respondent, it meant that person was making false statements. And so as I was just reading this, it kind of irked me that they're sitting right next to each other, what the preceding paragraph and then this one, and you seem perfectly lovely, and yet I wonder, and this is what you hear about when people are implementing policies like this, they take it upon themselves to say, well, you complainant, you must have made a false allegation. And so that's why I'm just asking, what can you tell us? I know this is a sensitive topic. What can you tell us about how this is dealt with currently? I think it goes back to the culture of any institution, what they think right here. So I've said enough, but I just would love to hear your response on that piece.
So I don't recall if it's specifically noted in the policy or in the administrative guidelines, but at least in some of my research, I think it's made it very clear that that is not to happen in the implementation of this policy. That is not supposed to happen. The fact that there's insufficient evidence to substantiate an allegation of sexual harassment doesn't then mean that the complainant made a false statement or knowingly made a false statement. It just means there was insufficient evidence to substantiate it. And that's the end of that. And the obligation to provide supportive measures remains. So that isn't what is supposed to happen. It's made clear that those are not one and the same. So that's not how I would implement the policy. I think as we train the folks that would have a role in the implementation, that would be made clear in the training. I personally don't have any anecdotal evidence of what has happened in the past if a student was thought to have made a false statement or there was an investigation that wasn't substantiated. I don't have any records or anecdotal evidence to tell you what has happened in the district. But that's definitely not how I would do things, and that's not and that would be made clear in the training that we provide to
my question is just would it be appropriate to note that somehow in the policy?
I think
That insufficient evidence alone shall not be the basis of saying someone made false statements or something like that. I'll let the attorneys take a stab at that.
seem analogous
Page
to
12
the six.
actually says that.
Oh, it does it? Okay,
Yeah, it
very
says,
separate.
it says charging an individual with code of conduct violation for making a false statement in bad faith, and we've introduced a new standard, in the course of a grievance proceeding shall not constitute retaliation, provided that a determination regarding responsibility alone is not sufficient to conclude that the party made a materially false statement in bad faith. I think that needs to be cleaned up a little bit because we've got knowing, intentional, and bad faith, which are three separate standards, all sort of used interchangeably throughout. I think that would be a good place, though, to put that. The other thing just to consider is when we look at retaliation and bringing claims and charges under the disciplinary policy, the areas that have come up, and it's very widely known that a very large university in the South was charging any student who brought a sex harassment claim with violating the school's drinking policy or violating the school's, curfew policy or things like that. I could see how there could be potentially, a student reports, I've been sexually harassed by whoever, and wait, when did this happen? You were cut in class, or you were, not where you should have been at that time. That does require discretion. I'm not sure you can write a policy around that, but it's sensitive and it needs to be considered.
True, and I do believe that the U.S. Department of Education put out some Q&A, and that was sort of one of them. I can't forget what they called it, but it basically was their take on if you had a policy that said, okay, let's say somebody reports sexual harassment to you, but to disclose the entire circumstances, they also tell you that they, there was underage drinking or whatever that might violate some other policy. They basically commented on whether or not you could have a policy that said, we want to know about the sexual harassment, so you're not going to get in trouble for the underage drinking or the other stuff, because we want you to report. So they did put a Q&A out on that. I don't know that there would be a good way
I think that we have an
to
immunity
put that in.
clause. We do have an immunity clause in our policy text. There's one there. You'll find it. You'll see it when you pull it up and give it to us and highlight it. You'll see that there's an immunity clause. There are two types of complaints we can file. Yes, formal and informal. Those complaints, particularly on the informal side, could be provided anonymously as well. We allow on any level of our organization for you to provide an anonymous, communication and do a formal or informal complaint that way. So again, I just look forward to what you bring back to us for us to really look where there's alignment and where there's misalignment, because a lot of this stuff, there's already stuff somewhat in play in our structure right now that allows for us to be able to deal with these kind of textured, nuanced, occurrences.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have read our non-discrimination, anti-harassment, and bullying-related policies. I haven't read all of the other ones unless they came up in an investigation. I've read the whistleblower policy because it's come up a couple of times. And I don't think there's immunity a clause in our anti-harassment policy, but we'll, like I said, I'll pull those for you, the ones that I know would kick in, and if those are under anti-fraud or something, I may not get those, but I'll see what we can do. And
Thank you. Physical violence, by the way, is also included in our anti-bullying policy. That includes sexual behavior, all the way up to, or all the way down to a simple gesture that might be found offensive that folks could actually informally or formally file a complaint against. So I look forward to what you bring back.
Okay.
Is there anything else from anybody on this policy this morning?
I would just say, just to put a bow on what we were talking about earlier, I think, thank you, Emily, for pointing out that final sentence in the retaliation section. That is confusing, and it even relates to it being, it refers to it in not being retaliation. So if others are amenable, I do think it belongs on page 6, just because if you think of the person implementing this policy, this is their guide. And if the next thing below it is about making false statements, it might be a good moment to remind them that insufficient evidence is not alone enough to constitute making false statements.
Sure. Yeah, I think of it as analogous to proceedings, you know, in the justice system, where you know, there's often non-convictions, and yet that person may or may not have done the conduct, and it does not mean that there's you know, false reports or lying necessarily. Perjury would be charged where it's appropriate, but that's very seldom. It's few of the matters where that occurs. Well, we've got a bunch of work ahead of us on this. The other thing that we're going to be seeing soon is an equity policy. This group worked extensively on an equity policy some time ago. It may be close to 2 years ago. That work has been, that effort has now been taken up by our equity officer, chief equity officer, Dr. Dion Blue, and I think they're about ready to report back to us, and that'll happen in the very near future. I don't know if it'll be the next meeting or likely sometime beyond that, because we've got lots more to do on this. In order to accommodate that office, we may need to change the date of our meeting. I know Dr. Blue mentioned that they've always had a conflict with our meetings, and that's because they do their internal staff meeting at the same time, and that we may need to talk about prospectively changing this, because I know she wants to be able to attend many of our meetings. So watch out for that. I suspect with this group that we may try using a doodle poll or something similar to try to figure out if we need to change the meeting time, you know, where we change it to. At this point, we're still on the schedule for 8:30 to 10 on the second Thursday of each month, which puts us next month at March 10 at 8:30, and obviously keep an eye out if we you know, need to make changes. And obviously, by keeping an eye out, I also mean, you know, respond quickly to whatever you get. And if it does happen to be, you know, a doodle poll or something of that nature, please provide, you know, all the dates that can work for you, not just the date that you'd like. The polls don't really work well otherwise. Any questions about any of that? I know I look forward to getting into the equity policy, back to it soon. One final thing, I believe, unless anybody else has anything, but I believe we've got one vacant slot. And, that we need to fill. And I would certainly welcome any suggestions any of you have. Simply, let me know, and we can take a look at that. I want you also to please give some thought to whether it makes sense to expand the size of the committee. We've had difficulty, as you know, in getting a quorum. I don't know whether expanding the size of the committee makes it easier or harder to get a quorum, because the quorum requirement would go up correspondingly. But you may want to give some thought to that, and I'm open to suggestion on any of it. That might require a change to our charter, but that's something that we developed in this committee, and then it would require board approval for a change in the charter, but that should be relatively easy if that's the kind of thing that we want to do. Questions? Anything more that any?
Just very quickly, I just wanted to, if it's appropriate, Mr. Chair, just to ask if there is just kind of as a quick poll right now, if there is a greater amenability to coming in the morning or coming in sometime in the afternoon or early evening. Is there a set of hours that folks feel like is a little more flexible in your time, that you actually have greater flexibility with?
I'm fine with either.
Okay. Same with you, Miss Emily?
Slight preference for morning.
Okay.
I'll be here when you're here.
But is there a preference?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Okay.
Oh, I have a preference for morning.
Okay.
Morning.
All right. Okay.
Even though I don't necessarily personally do best early in the morning anymore, I'm happy to continue.
Okay. It sounds like the administration needs to make an adjustment.
Well, there may be another day or something, but we can initially just have some conversation with Dr. Blue and her team and see how we're going to be able to accommodate them. All right.
Chair Brown, their meeting is at what time? At the same time as ours, 8:30 on,
I don't know if theirs is weekly or monthly
okay.
or what. I don't know if James,
I do
you
not
or
know.
Kyle or Aisha know.
I like, mornings are good, but with 10, if we move to 10, if we were flexible enough for mornings are good for me.
I'm guessing that that's probably not.
That doesn't really accommodate a work schedule.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
See, that's hard for people like me.
I understand.
Who don't always think about work schedule.
I don't either. Any longer. All right. Thank you all. Without anything more,
I move we adjourn the meeting.
Second.
without objection, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.